have a large one side, and let me assure you, no needle shall ever touch my skill again.
It's the number tattooed on his forearm, the flashes of the iron gate, the smell of smoke rising from somewhere he refuses to look. And in that moment, you can understand the entire architect of his villainy. He doesn't feel like a conqueror anymore. He doesn't feel like a threat. He feels like a child who survived something no child should ever have to survive, and who has spent his entire life, if not decades, trying to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again, no matter what it costs him. And that's the genius of Magneto's character. And today we're going to do something that I think the character genuinely deserves, which is to take him seriously, not just as a comic book antagonist in some cases, but also as a character to be studied.
What must we do to be good enough? Is this the high road's destination? If so, I say as I have too many times before, never again.
To fully understand Erik Lehnsherr, we have to fully understand him through the lenses of the Holocaust and what that does, what it has actually clinically been shown to do to the minds of the people who lived through it. And then we have to ask a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. When does a wound stop being something that happened to you and start becoming the lens through which you see everything? Psychiatrists and researchers who worked with survivors in the decades following World War II identified something that they called survivor syndrome. It's not a single clean diagnosis you can look up in the DSM. It is a constellation of traumatic responses that persist and evolve long after the physical danger is gone, and it manifests differently in every person who carries it. But across the research literature, certain patterns emerge with enough consistency that we talk about them with confidence, and every single one of them is present in how Magneto is written in the most thoughtful way. It is through that crisis of moral reasoning pattern that Magneto embodies completely. When the world has demonstrated at scale with bureaucratic precision that civilization is capable of organizing genocide, when the law itself was used as a primary instrument of dehumanization, the question of how to rebuild a moral framework becomes genuinely, agonizingly difficult. Some survivors emerge with a philosophy of radical humanization, a commitment to meaning, making that transform suffering into a foundation of a life devoted to others. Some retreated inward, finding that the only safe space was the self. Some built thick walls around their grief and never spoke about it at all. And some, a critical historical documented few, concluded that the only rational response to a world that has proved that it will always come for you is to ensure that the next time it tries, it failed. That's the only safety available to a targeted group, is not integration, not assimilation, not faith in the goodwill of the majority, but power, unambiguously unchallengeable preemptive power. When Stan Lee and Jack Kirby introduced Magneto in X-Men #1 in 1963, it was pretty obvious they weren't interested in complexity. They were operating in a different era of superhero storytelling, one that valued clarity over nuance, when readers needed to know immediately and unambiguously who was wearing the black hat or who was the bad guy, and Magneto wore it with full commitment. He showed up in a cape, declared his intention to bring the human race to its knees, and attacked a military base on his first appearance. There was no origin, no backstory, no hint of a wound underneath the rhetoric, just a powerful theatrical man who wanted to conquer the world, apparently because he believed mutants were superior and therefore decided to rule over the human race. For most of the Silver Age of comics, being the 1960s into the early 70s, the X-Men were defined against him. Charles Xavier's dream of peaceful coexistence and the fact that he believed that mutants and humans could share the world, the fear that could be overcome through demonstration of good faith, and that arc of history bent towards acceptance. Magneto believed in power, believing that the mutants should take what was theirs by force. The conflict between was written to be morally uncomplicated. Hope versus hatred, community versus domination, future versus past. Except those were the early years. If you pay close attention, there was a nagging question that the stories never quite answered. What made him the way that he was? What happened to this man to produce the level of conviction against humanity that he had? The Silver Age comics didn't ask that question because they didn't want to answer it. A villain with a coherent, historical grounded reasoning for his actions and beliefs starts to look uncomfortable when it looks as if he has a point. And in the early 1960s, Marvel was not ready to go there. That is until Chris Claremont took over. Magneto's origins in the issue titled I Am Forever Magneto opens on an act of genuine atrocity. Magneto, attempting to demonstrate the seriousness of his demands to the nations of the world, sinks a Soviet nuclear submarine and kills an entire crew. This is not portrayed as heroic, it is not framed ambiguously, it is a war crime committed coldly, and Claremont doesn't soften from it and he doesn't look away from it. The X-Men are horrified, the reader is horrified, and critically so is Magneto himself in ways that he could barely articulate. What happens next is where Claremont earns everything. Kitty Pryde is caught in the crosshairs in the subsequent confrontation between the X-Men and Magneto and nearly dies. And when Magneto sees what he has almost done, when he sees that this child was in danger because of his actions, his war against humanity, something inside him fractures. He holds her, he looks at her, and Claremont gives us access into his interior world in a way that he has never before, because Magneto at this moment remembers being a child in danger. He remembers a place where adults in uniforms decided that certain kinds of people do not deserve to live. He remembers the camps. He is at his core a Holocaust survivor, despite the sliding timescale in Marvel Universe. Every act of aggression, every ultimatum, every declaration of war on humanity has been at its root a response to that experience. It is through this detail that makes Magneto one of the most morally serious characters in all superhero fiction, because you can understand why he is the way he is. Erik Lehnsherr, and depending on which retcon you follow, has been called Max Eisenhart, he's been called Eric Magnus Lehnsherr, in various combinations therefore of all. Survived the SS concentration camp. He lost his family. He watched what happens when the government decides that a group of people are subhuman, when institutions fail, when society looks away, when the world collectively decides that someone else's extermination is not its problem. And this would later be expanded upon in Greg Pak's 2008 miniseries Magneto Testament, which positions him as a child who survived Auschwitz. He lost his family inside the camp. He was stripped of his name, his identity, his community, and his humanity by a system specifically designed to accomplish exactly that. And when his mutant powers first manifest with real force, it wasn't triggered by ambition, but rather by aggression. It was triggered by helplessness, by watching someone he loved being taken away from him, by reaching out with everything he had and being unable to stop it. And then he discovered he was a mutant and watched the world begin the process again. That was the engine of everything. That was the foundation of his character. When Magneto stands before the nations of the world and says that humanity will never accept mutants, he's not being paranoid or irrational or simply evil. He's doing what any reasonable person does with historical experience. He is applying that pattern of which he has lived through the simulation or through the situation directly in front of him. He has empirical evidence for his position. He has seen this film. He knows how it ends when the targeted group does nothing but hope that people in power decides to be decent. Claremont understood something that original creators have actively avoided engaging with. Magneto is the argument that Charles Xavier can't answer. Xavier's dream of peaceful coexistence is beautiful. It is genuinely powerfully beautiful, and there are real-world traditions of nonviolent resistance and patient coalition building that it draws upon meaning, but it requires something in return. It requires humanity to choose decency when fear would be easier. It requires institutions to be just when injustice is more convenient. It requires the majority to extend protections to the minority even when doing so costs them something. And Erik Lehnsherr has a very specific and very personal understanding of what happens when those conditions aren't met. What Marvel is depicting, whether the writers fully articulated it in those terms or not, maps with striking precision onto what trauma researchers and radicalization scholars call wound-based identity formation. This is the process by which a catastrophic group-targeted experience of violence doesn't just damage the individual's psyche, but reorganizes it around the injury. The wound stops being something that happens to you and becomes the structural center of who you are. Everything you believe, every relationship you form, every decision you make runs through the filter of that originating trauma. And when a trauma in question is not just personal but communal, when it is deliberate, systematic attempt to erasing an entire species or entire people, the identity that forms around it is not just personal but political. For Erik Lehnsherr, mutant kind becomes his new people, his community, the group whose survival he is willing to organize his entire existence around protect, and that lesson that the Holocaust burned into him. It is that when a minority group is feared, it is eventually targeted for elimination. That fear, left unaddressed and unopposed, becomes policy, and policy becomes atrocity. And the devastating honest thing about Magneto is that this analysis is not wrong. That is the history. That is exactly what happened. The difficulty of arguing with him is built directly onto the accuracy of his historical reading. This is not irrational thinking. It is not the reasoning of someone who has simply gone mad or given it into hatred. It is internally consistent, historically grounded, and in its own terms, strategically coherent. And that internal consistency is precisely what makes extremist ideology so durable and so difficult to dismantle. Not through argument alone, because the ideology isn't held together by argument, it's held together by fear and by a relationship to history that feels more real than any promise of a better future. Magneto is not simply a traumatized man who reached a breaking point and started doing bad things. He's a traumatized man who constructed a complete self-reinforced system of belief around his wound. And that system has a name in academic literature on radicalization. Erik Kruglanski, one of the most influential researchers in the study of extremist psychology, developed a framework he called significant quest theory. And it is one of the most useful tools we have in understanding why ordinary people with genuine grievances, people who have suffered real injustice, sometimes move towards ideological violence. The theory holds that radicalization happens when three distinctive elements converge. The first is what Kruglanski calls a significant loss. A humiliation, a dehumanization, a grief so profound that it destabilizes the person's sense of their own worth and their own place in the moral world order of things. The second is a narrative that makes sense of that loss through a framework of group identity, a story that explains the suffering not as a random or personal thing, but as a part of a larger pattern of persecution directed at the group to which the individual belongs. The third is a prescribed action, a clear path towards that promise to restore significance by transforming the victim into an agent, someone who is no longer simply suffering but is actively shaping the outcome. For Magneto, these three elements align with the most uncomfortable precision. His significant loss is the Holocaust in its entirety, the systematic execution of his family, the erasure of his name in history, the tattooed number that replaces his identity with a catalog entry in bureaucracy of death. His narrative is the mutant-human conflict and the historical analog he draws between it and every previous instance of majority group persecution of a feared minority. And his prescribed action is the project of mutant supremacy, not in his framing as an act of aggression, but as the only intellectual, honest response to a world that has already shown what it does to the vulnerable. What makes Magneto's arc in the comics so extraordinarily well constructed is that the text keeps confirming his threat assessment. Every Sentinel program, every Mutant Registration Act, every Genosha, every story in which mutants are imprisoned or experimented on are systematically hunted. The narrative keeps placing evidence in Magneto's corner. The world keeps proving him right about the dangers while simultaneously asking us to root against him for his response to it. The tension is not flawed in the writing. The tension is the entire point. There was a period in the 1980s which gave us something we never seen before. Magneto, in the sustained context of responsibility and care, becomes the headmaster of the New Mutants, a younger, less experienced team of mutant students, and his relationship with those kids are genuinely revealing. His methods are harder than Xavier's, his patience is thinner, he carries a worldview into the classroom in ways that sometimes clash badly with students who grew up in a different world, who don't carry the same significant weight of history that he does. He makes mistakes. He's not a natural teacher in the warm, open, patient way that Xavier was, but he shows up. Every day he is present. Every day he's invested in these kids' survival and their growth. When they are in danger, he moves to protect them with an intensity that has nothing calculated about it. It is pure, unguarded protectiveness of someone who has decided at whatever cost to himself that the next generation of mutants is not going to go through the experience that he has gone through. You understand what he is always actually fighting for. It's not about dominance or the subjection of the human race, not about power for power's sake. He wanted this, a place where mutant children could grow up safely, where their gifts don't mark them for destruction, where they could become whatever they were capable of becoming without a government program designated to eliminate them standing in the way. The tragedy of Magneto is that at times he is right. Magneto spent the better part of the 60 years warning everyone who would listen that mutant kind was in danger of extermination. He said it when the X-Men thought he was paranoid. He said it when the world thought he was a terrorist. He said it when even his own followers thought that he was overreacting. He built Genosha into a mutant homeland, a nation, however imperfect, where mutants could exist on their own terms under their own governance, because he believed that without something like this, his people had no structural protection against the forces that wanted them gone. Then in New X-Men 115 in 2001, Genosha was attacked. The Sentinels came, 16 million mutants were killed in a single day, the largest act of genocide in Marvel Comics history. While the world processed the news and largely moved on, 16 million people were gone because they were just born different, and the system that they were supposed to be protected under didn't protect them. And the dream of coexistence that Xavier had devoted his life to building turned out not to be sufficient armor against government programs with different dreams. And in that moment, you can say Magneto warned that this would happen. He said that this would happen. He had been saying it for decades, not in those specific terms, not in that specific date attached, but the shape of it. That organized state sanctioned violence against mutants was not a paranoid fantasy, but as an almost inevitable historical outcome if mutant kind didn't develop the means to protect itself and prevent this from happening. He had been right about that his entire adult life. He could not separate the urgency of what he knew from the violence of how he responded to it. He could not take the full weight of his historical knowledge and channel it into something that could actually build the world he wanted to build. Every time he got close, every time, like the Headmaster period, he seemed to be finding a different way. Something would crack and the trauma would come rushing back, and he would pick up the helmet again. This is what sustained trauma actually looks like. It is not a clean story of recovery or redemption. It is a cycle. It is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Sometimes it is 1 step forward and 2 steps back, and people who love you have to decide whether they can stay in the room with that, whether they can keep believing the version of you that is still trying, even when the version of you that is hurting keeps showing up instead. Magneto has endured as one of comics' most compelling figures for over 6 decades, not because he's frightening and not simply because he's sympathetic, but because he's comprehensible in ways that most fictional antagonists are never allowed to be. The path from Auschwitz to extremism, while profoundly tragic and generally dangerous, it is one of the most honest engagements with history that has to be acknowledged and makes a certain kind of sense. When you look at what we know about survivor trauma, about radicalization, about the way unprocessed grief in service of ideology reconstructs a person's relationship to the world, Magneto doesn't really look like a supervillain. He looks like a case study. He looks like what happens when a real historical atrocity meets a real psychological process and no one ever intervened in time. Charles Xavier's dream is not wrong, just flawed, and the desire for coexistence for a world in which difference is not grounds for destruction is a genuinely beautiful and genuinely necessary vision, but Xavier offers it to a man whose hope requires a vulnerability that was weaponized against him in an SS death camp, and he offers it as though it is simple, as though Erik should choose faith over history, as though those lessons of the 20th century are something you can just simply unlearn. Magneto's refusal, his terrible, costly, heartbreaking refusal, is the most honest thing about him, because he is not refusing out of spite. He's refusing because the world has not given him sufficient reason to believe it has changed. To him, he is not the villain of his story, but rather its first victim, as he could see the horrors of man. And the distance between the two things is the important space in all of X-Men. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do all the YouTube things, like, share, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think about Magneto. Again, there is a sliding time scale with Marvel. They never reboot their universe, so a lot of the information I'm going off of is early 2000s Magneto. So please let me know again what you think in the comments. I'm always loving hearing the feedback. I appreciate you all. Thank you for watching and have a great day. I'm Anderson, and I'm out.